Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him or through him. Verse 32, if God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and will give him glory at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. Really, a few more hours, folks. I'm with you only a little longer. You will look for me. And as I said to the Judeans, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment. Here it is, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if, everybody say if you have love one for another. Look at verse number 31. You may have noticed that Jesus' statements here in this section are very, very similar to what we saw just a few sessions ago back in chapter number 12, verse 23 and following. Again, John 12, 23 and following. What Jesus says here, again, very, very similar to what we saw before, as Jesus has repeatedly drawn attention to all throughout the gospel, is that he, again, is that official messenger, right, of the Father. So how is the Father glorified? The Father is glorified through his servant. Everything Jesus says, everything Jesus does brings what? Glory and honor to God. And we've talked about this over and over and over. What is the main way that we bring honor and glory to God? Via the words that we say and via the way that we treat one another. The actions that we do, these practical deeds of righteousness in his name. This is how God receives his glory and his honor. Let's not forget that first petition in the disciples' prayer, our Father who's in the heavens, let your name be sanctified. Our life should be all about seeing God's name sanctified. Remember, Jewish people believed and still believe that the main way that God's name is sanctified is via living an obedient lifestyle, a life of obedience to God. And as we'll see, Jesus sums up what this life is really all about. It's about what? Loving God and about loving one another. See, it's vertical, friend, but it's also what? It's also horizontal. It's not enough for us to say we love God. It's not enough even for us to say we love one another. We have to demonstrate that we love God. And then we have to demonstrate that love for God via the way that we treat one another. This is how this world will truly know that we're his disciples. Not that we have spirited preaching or teaching or we lay hands on the sick and see people recovered. No. Jesus says by this, by you imitating, by me imitating and following that pattern of self-sacrificing love to one another. That's how God receives glory. That's how we'll be known as his disciples. So he says in verse number 33, he says, listen, the time is very, very short. Again, they have no idea, I promise you, no idea that in just a few short hours he will be forcibly taken away from them. Okay, just a few hours. And Jesus says, like he told the Judeans before in chapter 7 and then also in chapter 8, remember he talked about going away and they couldn't really understand. He said, you're going to seek for me, but you're not going to be able to find me. And just as they were baffled, now we find the disciples themselves are really struggling to try and understand. Jesus, what are you talking about? But notice he calms their fears, doesn't he? Look at how he addresses them in verse 33. What does he call them? How does he address them? Look in your text. Come on, shout it out to me. Little children, teknia in Greek. It's little children. It's a delicate term, a tender term. We don't see this anywhere else in the Gospels. This is the first time we've seen Jesus address his disciples as my little children. My little children. Now, obviously, Jesus is the main host. He's in that fatherly role there as he presides over the Passover. And remember, Michelle just made allusion to this. She talked about it also last week. During the course of that 4-hour meal, the father would take questions from his children. And generally, there were 4 questions that were asked during that meal. Guess what? We have the same amount of questions asked during this meal. We find Jesus' disciples in the position of little children. And just like in every other Jewish home, there were questions being asked. So we find them with some questions. And we'll talk about that especially next week and the week to follow. But here, again, Jesus, for the very first time in this gospel, addresses them as little children. It was common for Jewish rabbis to refer to their disciples in this way because, remember, we taught discipleship between a rabbi and his students was viewed in the imagery of a loving family. So here we find Jesus saying, my little children. He says, I'm only going to be with you a little while longer. As we said, they didn't have a clue how short that time would be. But he tells them, again, they would seek him, but they wouldn't be able to find him. See, they couldn't join him in his Passover mission. There's only one who could die for the sins of this world. As willing as Peter might have been, I'll go down with you to the very end, Jesus. There's only one that could fulfill this mission. It's a path he had to walk alone, friend. But he wasn't alone. Remember what he told his disciples? Don't think that I'm alone. You may all abandon me, but I'm not alone. My Father is with me to the very end. But this is a path Jesus must walk alone. It's that path of denial. It's that path of suffering. But again, we know it's going to open the way for all of humanity to spend eternity with him. So thank God he walks that path. And then let's wrap it up tonight. Look at verse 34 and 35. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also should. And it's pretty weak in English. It's strong language. You must love one another in this way. It's not an option. Jesus is not giving us a good suggestion here. He is giving us a commandment, friend. He is giving each and every one of us a commandment to be obeyed. He says in verse 35, as we said, by this, everyone, pantes in Greek, it's all men or everyone, will know that you are my disciples if, let's say it together again, if you have love one for another. Now we know when we come to chapter number 15, Jesus has got a lot more to say about this new commandment. So we'll save the bulk of our discussion for when we come to chapter 15. But Andreas Kostenberger, a great scholar, has a great note here. He tallied some things up. When you look at the first 12 chapters of John, hear this now. When you look at the first 12 chapters of John, the word love occurs 12 times. Okay? In the first 12 chapters, the word love occurs 12 times. Buckle your seatbelt. Hear this. In chapter 13 through 17, okay, chapter 13 through 17, this final discourse with his disciples, how many times does the word love occur? 45 times. Hear it, friend. 45 times in chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. 5 chapters, 45 times. Do you think love is an important topic in the Gospel of John? Should love be an important topic for you and I? Oh, yes, friend, it should be. We've got to remember love is not to be understood here as some kind of emotional concept. Look, we live in the West today, don't we? And oftentimes people think love is something that has to do with emotions. Friend, the biblical concept of love doesn't have anything to do with emotions. It doesn't. Psalm 136, you want to write that down? Psalm 136, verse number 1. Hodul Adonai ki tov, ki le'olam chasdo, in Hebrew. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. His love endures forever. But that word love there is his covenant faithfulness, or his covenant love endures forever. Meaning God, when he says he loves us, he demonstrates it. And he is faithful to show and demonstrate love to those he's in covenant with. Got anybody in this room in covenant with God tonight? His covenant faithfulness endures forever. You hear that? His covenant faithfulness, his love for you, friend, endures forever. You don't have to ever doubt the love of God. His love endures forever. No wonder we should what? Give thanks to the Lord. For he is good. His love to us endures forever. See, this love is to be demonstrated in tangible ways. In tangible ways. God didn't just talk about loving us, did he? He has demonstrated his love to us. So therefore, if we claim to love one another, we have to demonstrate that love to one another. Jesus has demonstrated the love of God to his disciples. The text here says he loved them to the very end. To the very, very end. As we reflect on this passage and as we wrap things up tonight, let's not forget when God made that covenant with Israel and Mount Sinai, before he gave them any command, go look at it, Exodus chapter 19 and 20. You'll have to read it, Exodus 19 and 20. Before God makes any demands of his people, he reminds them, especially read Exodus 19, the first 3 verses. Exodus 19, 1 through 3. God is going to remind them, isn't he? He's going to say, remember how I've demonstrated my love to you. I've brought you out of bondage. I have delivered you. I have demonstrated love to you. Therefore, I want to have a covenant with you. I want to have a relationship with you. And that relationship is not based on a bunch of do's and don'ts. That relationship has got to be based on what? Love. Primarily, this covenant that we have with God centers on his love towards us. But then remember, he expects us to what? Love him. And how do we demonstrate that love to him? We obey his commandments. Hello? Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, he is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. In light of what God has done for us, we should love him with everything, without reservation. But then there's Leviticus 19:18, right? Remember, Jesus has asked the question, teacher, what's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And there's another equal to it. Love your neighbor as yourself. So when Jesus is talking about love here, this is not a new concept. Okay? They realized that God had called the people of Israel to be a community of covenant love, showing love to God and love to one another. This is how they were to be a light to the dark nations. Not just talking about loving God. But see, this world's got to look at us, how we treat one another. They've got to see the kingdom work. We are great about talking about it, I know. Where I fail, maybe where you fail, is in that practical demonstration of love on a regular basis. Anybody have some struggles from time to time loving your neighbor? Don't act so smug. You struggle, friend, so do I. But it is by this that the world will know that we truly are his disciples. So what is new about this commandment? What's new about the commandment? Let's look at it. What is new about it? They are to love one another just as he has loved them. That's what's new about this commandment. They knew they had to love God. They knew they had to love one another. But Jesus is pushing them now to what? Love one another in the same pattern and in the same way that he has loved them. That takes a lifetime of devotion, doesn't it? That takes prayer. That takes devotion. That takes work, friends. We are not just automatically going to love one another like this. But this is the new commandment. This is the new commandment. If we are in covenant with him, this is not an option. We should love one another. If we've experienced the tangible love of God and love of Christ in our life, then he expects us to what? To demonstrate that same type of love to one another. He loved us unconditionally. He loved us via the cross. And so when Jesus lays this on them, I'm sure it was heavy. But can you imagine how they were going to contemplate and understand this post-resurrection, post-crucifixion? When they reflected back on his words, they weren't really aware that he was about to go and die on a cross for them. They knew he had loved them, but they weren't going to experience the full beauty and magnitude of his love until what? A few hours down the road. So friend, God expects us to love one another to this extent, and that is not easy. It is not easy. I want to close tonight, and I'm going to ask you to turn over, if you would, to 1 John. 1 John chapter 3, verse number 11, if you'd like to turn there with me. 1 John chapter 3, verse number 11. Listen to what John says and see if it doesn't sound very familiar. For this is the message which you have heard from the beginning, that we should what? That we should love, but what? One another. That's the important part, that we should love one another. Not that we should love God. Yes, we should, obviously. But that we should love one another. And guess what? Don't be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. Do not wonder, brethren, that the world hates you. We know, hear this, verse 14, we know that we have passed out of death into life because why? We love the brethren. He who does not love abides in what? Death. Anyone who hates his brother is a murderer. Hear this. Anyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us. And we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But if anyone has the world's good and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children. Remember that phrase? Is all this sounding familiar? Little children, let us not love in word or in speech, but in what? But in deed and in truth. Folks, this is how we demonstrate the love of God. If we really have love, we are demonstrating it in the way that we treat one another. All right, John chapter 13, verse number 36. Let's pick up there. We want to read through verse number 38. Let's look at it together. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Remember back in verse 33, Jesus had told them that he's going away. And we've seen that theme throughout the Gospel of John. He's warned people in the past that there's going to be a time coming up where he's going to go away. Now he said this to his disciples in verse 33. We talked about it last session. So now Peter comes back to this issue and says, all right, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered, where I am going, you cannot follow me now. Everybody say now. But you will follow afterward. Everybody say afterward. Verse 37, Peter said to him, Lord, why can't I follow you right now? I'll lay down my life for you. Jesus answered, will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly, or amen, amen, I tell you, before the cock crows, you will have denied me how many times? 3 times. We know this text well. We know when we read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we find in all of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this reference to the fact where Peter is going to step up and say he is willing to die on behalf of Jesus. He's willing to literally put down or lay down his life on behalf of Jesus. And we'll find in each case Jesus is going to have to predict that just in a few short hours, what's going to happen? He's going to deny that he even has any association whatsoever with Jesus. So before the rooster crows, as it were, Peter, his great boast, is it's not going to work out so good, is it? No, it's going to result in great humiliation. But we know the story doesn't end there, right? If we continue to move through the Gospel of John, we know that there's hope for Peter, isn't there? Yeah, there really is. Jesus will reinstate Peter later on in this Gospel. And we know that Jesus will also go on to tell him that there will come a time at some point in the future where Peter's death will in fact bring glory and honor to God. And according to early church tradition, it seems to be quite credible that when Peter was about to be crucified, tradition says he said, I'm not worthy to die like my Lord. You put me on the cross upside down. And Peter's death brought glory and honor to God. So it looks really bleak right here in these passages we just read, doesn't it? But we have to continue reading. So we'll talk a lot more about this issue of Peter's upcoming glorification of Jesus through his death as we come into especially chapter number 21. Now what we want to do is go right into chapter number 14. So come back to your text if you would. Let's think about this just for a minute. We know how this text begins, don't we? Let not your heart be troubled. Let not your heart be troubled. It's little wonder that we find the disciples are troubled at this point in chapter number 14. Let's think about it for a minute. Okay? let's consider everything that we've read up to this point in John chapter 12 and 13. And then let us consider what we also read in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Think of everything Jesus, in just the last few minutes, has said to his disciples. Notice it. First of all, he tells them that he's going to what? He's going to go away. Okay? Then he says he's going to die. Then he tells them one of the 12 is actually going to betray him. Then he says that Peter is going to disown him 3 times. Then, if we consider what Luke says, we find that Satan was seeking to have the disciples in order to sift them as wheat. And then we find that Jesus in Matthew 26 predicts that all of them on that very night are going to stumble or fall away. So you can imagine why Jesus has to say these words in light of everything that's happened in just the last few moments in this Last Supper or Passover scene. So they need great encouragement. You ever need encouragement? You ever need to hear these words? Don't let your heart be troubled. You ever find yourself being troubled? Hello? You ever find yourself being stressed out? Yeah, we're talking about disciples here. We're talking about this happens to each and every one of us, and I think we can find great solace in this great text that we have here. So let's read our text. We want to look at just the first 3 verses. Here's what it says. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe or trust in God. Believe or trust also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, what does Jesus say? I will come again and take you to myself. Why? So that where I am, there you may be also. This is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful text. All of us in this room, I'm sure over the years, if we've been walking with the Lord for any amount of time, we have all found great comfort in this passage. Go back to verse number 1. Again, look how it begins. It's very strong in the Greek text. It's in the command form. He says, don't let your heart be troubled. It's that same word, troubled, as Michelle spoke to us about last week, that we've seen throughout the Gospel of John. We find that Jesus oftentimes is troubled, right, in his soul, or others are troubled. Now Jesus tells his disciples, in light of everything, yes, I'm going to be taken away. Yes, we're going to be separated. Yes, my life's going to end as far as my earthly life in just a few moments or in just a few hours. But in light of all of that, don't let your hearts be troubled, or don't let your heart be overcome with turmoil. And then notice what he says. We've got another command. He says, but keep believing. Remember, all throughout the Gospel of John, we find this great emphasis on the need to believe, on the need to trust. That's the best way to translate the Greek word pisteuo here. It means to trust in God. How many know sometimes we just have to trust Him when in times we don't understand, in tough, in difficult times, when our heart is broken, when it seems like everything is falling apart. That's when we have to what? Continue to trust and believe. Remember the great story we had most recently in John chapter 11 when Lazarus had died and Martha was asked, do you believe this? And she says, look, I have believed and I am continuing to believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God. Meaning the death of her brother, the most catastrophic thing, the most heartache that she had ever experienced, that was not going to shake her trust in God. What a great truth that is for all of us. Because sometimes it's easy to trust when everything's going well, isn't it? It's when we're down in that valley, as it were, that our faith is put to the test. And we have to trust in God's goodness, don't we? So what does Jesus say? You trust in God, and have you know God is completely faithful. All throughout the biblical text, what's emphasized in every book of the Bible? The faithfulness of God. Do a study on it. In every book that we have in our biblical text, the faithfulness of God is emphasized. We can trust Him at all times, no matter what. And so Jesus says, remember, He's using this messenger, heavenly messenger imagery. He is the very representative of God. And so if they can trust in God, they need to also what? Trust in Him. That everything is going according to plan. Even though the disciples may have some hard time understanding how all of this is in the perfect will of God, they need to continue to trust in God and in His plan. I'd say we've got to do the same thing, friend. Times are going to come in our life where it's going to seem like this can't be the plan of God, and we've got to what? We've got to trust in Him. No matter what we feel like, no matter what circumstances look like, let's continue to trust in Him. And then look at verse 2. It's a great verse. In the household of my Father there are many dwelling places, and if it were not so, would I have told you that I am going to prepare a place for you? Jesus uses some very figurative language here. He describes via a metaphor or a figurative language, and he talks about the fact that he's going to what? He's going back to the Father's house. Okay? And what's he going to do once he's at the Father's house? He's going to prepare a place for who? Yeah, the disciples there, and we believe for us as well, for all disciples, and that there will be many dwelling places there. There's a place for all believers in the presence of God, and I'm glad about that, aren't you? Yes, there's room in the Father's house, as the saying goes.